Welcome guys to another episode with the Doomed Hell. I wanted to talk about Radeon's wins against Nvidia's products today, as I think it's something only talked about by a niche amount of channels, and it's actually quite interesting. As we all know, the RX 6900 XT claims and probably will demolish the newly released RTX 3090, and will probably clean the floor in a lot of benchmarks that were previously taken over by Nvidia, now facing serious domination by ATI. The reasons why Radeon are doing so well this year is due to the success AMD has had with acquiring investments in modern technologies, as well as the poor R&D work of Nvidia's side. Basically, the tides have turned versus a couple of years ago. As we all should know, Radeon has historically been a better bang for buck than Nvidia's products, as well as performing overall more efficiently in some or most tasks in terms of performance per watt. However, recently that was not necessarily the case. Every now and then, Radeon has always tried to push the envelope in terms of what their architectures could handle, which is why we had GPUs such as the 290X die, the Fury die, and of course the well-known Vega die, all of which were not the most power efficient, but gave a really good powerhouse bang for buck. AMD has also pushed their machine learning products forward to try to give similarly good bang for buck for scientists and other computational power users. However, for the first time in a while, Radeon has had the stars align for RDNA 2 release, and it's amazing. Firstly, RDNA 2 has basically incremented on every good aspect of RDNA 1. It scales better in cores, it has better IPC than prior gen, the overclocking is absolutely solid. Thanks to the quality die, and this is all thanks to the early investment in 7nm TSMC. RDNA has also another trick up its sleeve: its memory configuration. Nvidia went with a very queer architecture. For the first time in a while, they did not modulate their CUDA cores for a more efficient performance per CUDA core. In the past, every single Nvidia architecture prioritized CUDA core optimization and adding a little bit more stream processors per architecture, whilst also guaranteeing the performance increase. Basically, they always were making sure that their CUDA cores were modulating properly per generation. For the first time in basically all of Nvidia's history as a GPU manufacturer, 4300 Ampere cores is weaker than 4300 Tesla or even Pascal or Turing cores. This on its own is a bit of a worrying factor for Nvidia users. Some of us smartasses think that it makes no difference. How many stream processors a GPU has is not proportional to how powerful it is. This is kind of false. If a GPU can modulate its stream processors in a linear fashion, as we've seen in previous generations to both its predecessors and its lower end products, it's guaranteed to have a good driver support, have decent future ending support by games, and in general is likely to do well. We can take Fermi as an example. Fermi was not a very power efficient card, and per CUDA core it wasn't really performing that well. Not that many years later, they just quit the driver support entirely. If we don't want to see these kinds of changes, basically Nvidia has to cook their architectures and their products better. They have to take more time in doing so, but fact is, Ampere was undercooked. With an architectural change like this, Nvidia is basically saying that they're ditching their old systems, or they're going to promote this new low performance per core setup, and they're going to ditch it because it's stupid and historically doesn't work. So it's either going to be that we're seeing a architectural change with Nvidia, in which they're always going to be pushing more CUDA cores in this non-linear fashion, and we're going to see worse and worse performance per CUDA core, which, by the way, every CUDA core takes just about the same performance per watt typically. So what they're actually reducing is probably cache and just all the resources that a CUDA core would need, which is bad news for most of us in terms of lower end power users, for instance. Or they're probably just gonna go back to their old ways. Next generation will have less CUDA cores, but they will be more power efficient, even more power efficient than we saw with Turing and Tesla. What NVIDIA had up its sleeve was its memory config. Turing was extremely limited to memory bandwidth on GDDR6 when it came to high-resolution gaming, which is why I believe they worked upon hardware real-time ray tracing technology. It wasn't a bad idea. A chip which deals with shaders individually whilst hardware-enforced software is written to deal with this method, allowing for better-looking shaders and dropping the stress on the stream processors is kind of ingenious, well, in an evil way. NVIDIA had the funds to push programmers into using their new ray tracing APIs, whilst also having the funds to create its new ray tracing core. And it's not like it's the first time they've ever enforced new technologies on both monopolize the market and revolutionize how we render games. This is probably their most influential attempt yet, which is the opposite of what I thought was going to happen. However, games which still utilize heavily detailed textures and rendering a large proportion of their games weren't dead in the water yet with NVIDIA. The research for more memory and memory bandwidth is always necessary, it seems. GDDR6X was a great move by NVIDIA and made sense as they did the same practice with Pascal. If it wasn't for high bitrate GDDR5X, they were sure to lose a lot of their performance in the top end, causing RX Vega, an extremely memory optimized GPU, to have won the 4K gaming benchmarks, just as Vega destroyed the 4K video rendering and other workstation benchmarks. Memory bandwidth was probably a priority with Ampere. GDDR6X is an impressive feat in performance and delivers a great amount of raw bandwidth for what it had to deal with. I'm impressed with NVIDIA on that aspect. AMD, however, played smart and played fair. Instead of pushing GDDR6 controllers and configurations to its limits while causing the fragile new graphics VRAM to overclock poorly and potentially cause extreme manufacturing costs, AMD decided to use one of their investments once again to tackle the issue at hand. They developed the first GPU to use Infinity Cache, a high bandwidth, high capacity cache, which is used in pair with the GDDR6 they had on the board already. This is a setup that probably saves the whole RDNA 2 release on PCs. Imagine 512 gigabytes per second is not enough for you for your 4K experience. Behold 2.5 terabytes of super fast cache capable of alleviating the need for HBM2E in applications of high texture gaming or otherwise. Now, although HBM2 4096-bit would have been great up against the newest NVIDIA GPUs, the technology would have been too expensive to produce as a mainstream GPU, meaning I will personally have to buy a Radeon 7 when I decide to upgrade. But the question is, theoretically, how does Big Navi's memory setup deal up against RTX 3090s and 3080s GDDR6X? Here's some basic math. GDDR6X is reportedly at 936 gigabytes stock at 24 gigabytes max memory. I assume with some overclocking it'll run around 1 terabyte per second, which is awesome for base GDDR technology. This is just quickly in the air. If you think about it, 24 gigabytes running in stream doing 936 gigabytes per second. I'm sure that with a small overclock, that extra 60 to 70 gigabytes per second would be very easily unlockable. However, an RTX 3080 competing directly with Big Navi's GPUs only holds 10 gigabytes of that sweet high bandwidth VRAM. And with less VRAM comes lower memory bandwidths as well. The 3080 really only has around 850 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth, and I'm being very generous here. I didn't just add 60 or 70 gigabytes per second. I think I added over 100. That's still great, but not as impressive as 3090s. And in a second, I'll show you how it's actually not that impressive even up against Infinity Cache. So now that for the part of the video where I actually calculate the unified memory config with Big Navi, benchmarks were literally just released less than an hour ago. And it seems as though, in normal terms, I would say Big Navi is running around the 1 terabyte per second bandwidth as well. This is considering that this is at looking at multiple games which either utilize the infinity cache somewhat poorly to using it actually quite well in terms of looking at frame times and all that kind of stuff. You can see that the memory cache is actually being very well utilized. The reviews literally just came out, and this is what we're seeing. Games with better infinity cache usage tend to favor the RX 6800 and 6800 XT versus the 3080 on average frame rates and frame times. Whilst when the infinity cache isn't being utilized properly, the average is still relatively good, but it's slightly throttled in the lows and in the frame times. So in some games, your 3080 is beating them out slightly on the average, and in a larger proportion in the in the 1% lows, in the 0.1% lows. However, what's actually kind of interesting is that the infinity cache isn't actually throttling too much, as the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows are not far apart. So that's a very good thing for AMD. It means that they actually use the infinity cache quite well. However, with better driver supports and with better updates on all these video games, I'm sure that AMD will have the lead on these things. These are things that you can easily fix through software. That's where the AMD cards really shine, because what we're seeing here is already scary for NVIDIA, but what will happen later is even scarier, because if infinity cache is actually being utilized properly, as we see it now, basically what's happening is the drivers are somewhat optimized, and they're still in a bit of a raw form. And so once they're optimized slightly better, we will see that the infinity cache will end up being closer to the 1 terabyte per second bandwidth that the 3090 would have, which means basically the 6800 is no longer memory bound in terms of 1440p and maybe even 4K. And we'll probably see that much more often. But as it stands, it's fair to assume that the combo of VRAMs create a close to 100% increase in bandwidth over the regular GDDR6 in performance as shown, but with suboptimal utilization, it seems as though the GPU is hitting closer to the 600 gigabytes per second mark as its preceding peers have had in storage. So it seems as though, although when the infinity cache is being used properly, when it isn't being used properly, it tends to lack a little bit, and it's hitting around the same amount of the same difference between the lows and the average frame rate, as well as around the same or average frame rate as its peers, if we were to theoretically bring more stream processors in its peers' GPUs. So if we look at a 5700 XT and we gave it a theoretical amount of stream processors, and then we gave it the 16 gigabytes that a 68 or 6800 XT has, we clearly see that it would get close to the average in the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows that the newest release has, maybe like in the margin of 5% error. That is quite interesting. Basically, it means that in the games which are suboptimal, we're getting literally big Navi. We're getting like the literal definition of a big die 5700 XT. And in games that properly utilize the infinity cache, we're getting a properly new RDNA 2 GPU that doesn't throttle that much on 4K and 1440p. That's pretty impressive. So we're not talking just about performance, but we're also talking about upgraded performance in terms of generational upgrade, which is really interesting. Overall, I want to say that the benchmarks just came out. I looked at a lot of them, and it seems as though RX 6800 and 6800 XT are not just the new R9 290, because the 290 was a really hot card. I mean, they put really bad stock GPU fans on them, but the whole VRM fiasco and the whole heatsink fiasco was really bad when they first came out, and they they had gotten better and better over time through aftermarket, and then at one point they also got 8 GB of full-fledged GDDR5 and 512 bits. That was very impressive. Excuse me. This is not like that. This is like giving a very good product right from the get-go. And if the rumors are true, we're not getting the stock right away, but this is literally beating NVIDIA at its own game. And I'm very happy that AMD has finally pushed through. Thank you, ATI, for creating great cards. And that's my cue to leave. Thanks, guys, for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I tried to compress it as much as possible. And yes, I won't be buying an RX 6800 as I thought I was going to, but I will probably buy a Radeon 7 this summer. Have a good day.